Good morning, everyone. By various clocks, it is either 9 or 10 o'clock, and either way, good for us to get started. Hope everybody enjoyed their extra hour of sleep or extra hour of sitting and drinking coffee or whatever the case may be for you. For me, sleep. We are in 2 Samuel, and we're going to be in chapter 8 in just a second, but we had one more question to look at in chapter 7. Remember that chapter 7 was David and Nathan coming up with this plan to build a house for God. And we talked last week how this, every indication seems to be that this was rooted in sincerity, that it was rooted in respect for God, of wanting to do something that would honor God and that would be good for the people as well. Yet God does tell David, or tells Nathan to tell David, did I ask for this? Was that something that I ever asked for, or something that I require in order to lead you and to be your God? And so God reveals to David that, in fact, David is not going to build him this house, that there's no need for this right now, that even though God does approve of the general concept of building a temple, because Solomon is going to do that for him, he doesn't want it to come from David, and he wants it to be on his terms, not David's terms. And so David has taken all of these steps so far in building up the united nation of Israel, of trying to keep things together, and this would have been a very helpful thing in helping to solidify both the religious and political center being Jerusalem. So this has to be a bit of a disappointment that God has said no. And so the question that I have for you is, how does David respond to God vetoing his plan? Gary, sorry. Mm-hmm. He doesn't argue at all, and that is an extremely important part of this, that he doesn't even really try to make his case to God or say, are you sure? He seems to accept it very readily. Okay?
Well, you read Psalm 8, Psalm 89, both of them were very positive towards the God
Yes, absolutely. He's very positive about this. Lisa?
because it's not necessarily a good thing that I'm sure you feel wonderful about not being able to build a temple, but to build a house for God. But there's a commitment by God to keep his lineage on the throne. Something solid there. And so I think it says, fulfill the promise forever. That forever that you have made to your servant and his house. So there's something to be said for, this isn't coming to you, but it will fit into your house. And David makes provision from now until Solomon becomes king to acquire what is needed for destruction when the time comes.
Yes, absolutely. So there is a lot of thankfulness here, which we'll talk about some in a sec. Jim?
One of the things that I noticed was that he still respected God in the sense that he said, I'm a servant, I'm your servant. And in his prayer, he said that it was still God's choice. And he understood that was no matter what he did, if he was doing it wrong, then God said, I don't want you to do that. And David said, I'm your servant, whatever you say is right.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember, the idea behind this was that it was to honor God and to show this respect and reverence for God. This is a pretty good test of whether that's actually David's motivation or not. Because when God says, I don't want you to do this, if David pushes back and says, what do you mean? I'm going to do this anyway, then it very clearly isn't really about God, it's really about David. Even on like a very personal level, on a level between equals, we understand that. If you tell your spouse that you're going to get them some expensive gift that they're really going to like, and they say, but I don't want that. And you say, too bad, I'm getting it for you. Like, maybe the gift wasn't for them, right? Maybe it's more about what you want, and that's just a gift between equals. How much more with David saying he's going to build this house for God. Ida?
I was just thinking that he went ahead and prepared for future time, and we need to do that too. How often do we get, like we want to teach everybody, but if we don't have the classes right now, all of that is experience. But what are we doing to prepare ourselves to teach those classes?
Yeah. There's a lot of things that it's in the course of time that something's going to happen, and the preparation is important too. And David shows that he's willing to prepare for Solomon and to do the not as glamorous work there. Who is it that's remembered for building the temple? It's not David, it's Solomon. Yet David did a lot of work for it. And for the most part, he's not really remembered for that. I mean, we do talk about it, and it's important, but the real glory of the event goes to Solomon. That has got to be a hard thing for somebody who had in his head that he was going to be the one to build this. It was going to be that huge building project. So one thing that you've hit on in your answers to this is David's gratitude, David's joy about this, and that kind of stands in some opposition to the way that I've worded this question. I've worded this question very negatively of God vetoing David's plan. But really, chapter 7 did include that God said, no, I don't want you to build this house. But it also had a lot to say about God making this promise and covenant with David that he was going to be with him and be with his descendants going forward, that he was going to build up David's house. There's a lot of promise to David in this, yet it would be very easy for David to only hear the negative, to only hear that God is telling him no. In fact, David is doing the right thing here in that he hears the promise that God is making to him, and he is so grateful for it. And so that prayer of gratitude that he offers in the last part of this chapter is filled with awe and filled with praise for God because of everything that God has promised to David. Gary.
And it definitely shows that we can get something in our heart that sounds good, sounds like an excellent idea, sounds like the right thing to do. Even to Nathan, it sounds like the right thing to do. God is with you. But it was based on God's word, like we've been saying. But there's a huge lesson, even in the area of good works. But what does God's word say about whatever our idea is?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Jeff.
David had the attitude, he's the king of Israel. But when he's talking to God, it's like, who am I that you're pointing to God? He showed very humble, even though he was the king.
Absolutely. His heart is in the right place here. And that's the argument that we made from the beginning of this chapter. And you could see it going either way until you get to this point. David's reaction here, I think, validates his intentions the whole time. That he meant this to honor God, and when God corrects him and tells him he doesn't want him to do this, well, then David goes on to what will honor and glorify God. And he frequently calls himself God's servant in this prayer, and has so much praise to offer because he knows just how glorious God is. And coming from a king, coming from somebody who has lots of people who will listen to him and do what he commands, that is a lot of humility. There are not many kings in the histories of Israel and Judah who show that sort of humility. And really, kings of any nation throughout history tend to not express that humility the way that God would want them to. Betty.
And now, O Lord God, you are God, and your words are truth. If everyone really believed that, it would change the way people
Yes.
can, where they live their life.
In all that we've seen so far in the story of David's life, he's not been perfect in every decision. There's been some times he's been a little farther from God, a little closer to God, some decisions that are hard to justify, some things that he even outright takes responsibility for that were terrible decisions. But again, what we have seen out of David is it is of the utmost importance to him to keep coming back to God. And it's because of what he knows here about God that Yahweh is the only God and that his words are true. So no matter what happens, no matter how much David is taken by surprise in some of these things that God wants for him to do or doesn't want for him to do, he greatly respects that. Anything else through the end of chapter 7? Okay. Chapter 8. Chapter 8 shifts gears away from this discussion of building a house, though we will see more about that in the future, and now just looking at some more history of things that David did in his rule. Of course, when we look at the chronology of these things, a lot of times the sense of speed and time increases or slows down and in various chapters. We go forward to talk about one theme, and then we rewind to talk about another event that has to do with another theme. The events in chapter 8 take place over a pretty long period of time. There are multiple wars here. And so don't read these historical books as if they are chapters in a novel that everything in chapter 8 happens, and then everything in chapter 9 happens, and then everything in chapter 10 happens. This is a chapter focused on the wars that David fought and why he did that and what he was trying to accomplish as he did so and what the end was of a lot of these wars. But that doesn't mean that all of these happened in a very short period of time or anything like that. So the first thing that we are told, I don't want to talk about Moab yet, I want to talk about the Philistines. We've talked about the Philistines so much in Joshua, Judges, and in the books of Samuel. The Philistines have been the thorn in the side of Israel for a long, long time. They're powerful people. They've got 5 strongholds, 5 kings who rule over them. And frequently, especially in the book of Judges, we see that it's the Philistines who come and oppress Israel, who are able to force them to pay tribute or to harm them in various ways, to defeat them in battles quite easily. We see there's a whole stretch of time where they don't have any weapons in Israel because the Philistines have taken away their blacksmiths and have taken away the tools they need to even make weapons. What kind of control and influence do they have to have over this region to be able to do that? It's very strong. And of course, all throughout Saul's reign, he's fighting the Philistines. In fact, several times we saw when he was chasing David, the only reason that he turned back from chasing David was because the Philistines were somewhere else again and were trying to fight against Israel. He had to go and address that. The Philistines were the main reason why Israel even wanted a king. It was not just about them, it was about all of their enemies, but the Philistines were at the top of the list. We need a king who can protect us from these enemies, who can conquer them, who can keep us free. Yet Saul was not really able to fulfill that. He did well at first, and then as he got farther and farther away from God, he had less success against them. What we read in verse 1 is, after this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and David took Metheg-ammah out of the hand of the Philistines. And what is important for us to see here is this is a turning point in the battles against the Philistines. That after this point, we'll still hear about the Philistines here and there, but they are never again the sort of threat that they were in years past. They're a much smaller player in the events of the region and in the affairs of the region. They are no longer the main enemy that Israel has to deal with. This Metheg Ammah is a little bit difficult here. This is the only place in the Bible and the only place in secular history and archaeology that we know of this word. It's a little unclear what it means. It might be a city with the name Metheg Ammah, but we don't have any record of such a city. It literally means the bridal of the mother city, which is interesting, but doesn't necessarily help us. And does anybody heard what probably is the best solution for what this is?
From what I understand, Mother City.
Yeah.
So that could have been secular hub or something central to the area.
Yeah. So probably something like that. Could just be not even about one city in particular, but just that David had this success over the Philistines and took their power and control from them. It is interesting to note that 1 Chronicles 18:1 is basically the same verse, but instead of Metheg Ammah, it does say Gath. So it could just mean Gath. Why it would have Metheg Ammah instead of Gath, I don't know. Of course, Gath was a very important city to the Philistines. That was, a city that you could viably call a mother city. So it could just mean that. But it could also be referring to something else along with the conquering of Gath. Ultimately, we don't really know. I think Gath is probably one of the better answers, or just a more general answer of taking that power and control from the Philistines. But the idea here that we need to have in our heads is that the Philistines are subdued. They are not a major threat to the Israelites anymore. Okay. So next up on the list of wars is Moab. Why did David go to war against Moab? This is more context outside of this chapter. We see lots of wars, but and let me just frame it this way for you first, before you answer the question. Israel's destiny was not to go to war against every nation in the world. That was not God's plan for them. They were not to take over the whole world. They were not to be, warmongers. It was not that they were trying to stretch an empire from sea to shining sea. The wars that they had were for particular purposes. So why Moab? Lisa.
Well, there was big constant aggravation in that district. They didn't get their food or something like that. Didn't want Israel to come. They didn't get their food when they passed by the land of Egypt. And then they also called on Balaam to curse them.
Yeah. So they have been historical enemies of Israel from early days when Israel was weak, was not a threat to them at all, and was in need of help. The Moabites rejected them, refused to help them, refused to give them food. Early on, trying to curse them, to bring that power of Baal against them. All of these kinds of things. Moab has been the aggressor, the instigator of this conflict between the two nations. And what began in those early days has just continued over the passage of time. That the Moabites frequently did come and fight against Israel, frequently were oppressors and antagonists against them. We saw them some in the book of Judges. And God had said in Numbers 24:17 that one day Israel would defeat Moab, that this battle was not going to go on forever, but eventually Israel would subjugate them. Okay.
Well, he did take his parents there
That's an interesting twist to this, that David has some family ties to Moab. His great-grandmother Ruth was from Moab, and he took his parents there for safekeeping when Saul was chasing after David. We don't know what happened to David's parents. I saw some speculation amongst the commentators that maybe the Moabites did not treat them well, or maybe even killed them. That's ultimately speculation. We really have no idea. In fact, we don't need something like that to understand why David would go to war against Moab. Even if he has these, and we know he does, have these family ties to Moab, and even though he has put his parents there for safekeeping, he still views as more important the necessity of following the promise that God had made, that Israel would defeat Moab. And so it's more important for him to do the work of the king that Yahweh anointed rather than whatever his family ties might be.
Well, really, negated her national religion and all that went with Moab.
Yeah.
Wanted nothing to do with that. God.
Right.
She wanted to follow.
Yes, absolutely. Even still, though, those family connections and heritages, are hard to fade away, and hard for David to maybe personally want to say, let's go to war against Moab, where part of my family comes from. Yet he does realize what Ruth realized, that there was trouble in Moab, and that she didn't need to be going along with what they were doing. Steve?
Later in the chronicler explains that the Moabites surprised Jehoshaphat, and was going to overwhelm them, but surprised himself. And God said he would take the war. They didn't need to fight it. He was going to take care of the Moabites. And then later, I don't know if it's the last year of Moabites, but Jehoshaphat and Elijah, I believe, were considering an attack on the Moabites. And was it, the king in Samaria was not David, it was Joram, right? And I remember with those that wait, we need to consult God, we need that He is God, and this is from desperate act out.
Yeah, that's some good summation of some things that happened later on with Moab as well. Moab is not going to completely go away here as a result of this war. They're going to cause some problems later on as well. But David is going to make a pretty good stand against them, as we'll see momentarily. Mark?
Yeah, it's no surprise that this chapter comes after he asks to do something that would have taken all his time.
Yeah.
That instead of doing that, this is what he did. And we see him, that unified nation. What it could have done the whole time. But he just didn't know that. He just needed a single leader to point to God. And then you just see him, here he's guarding the south. This is brutal what he does to Moab. It's horrible when you look at it on its face. But there's a reason, and I'm sure there's good reason for it. Godly reasons. But then you start putting these outposts around all these rogue nations that are going to be against them if they're not careful.
Yeah.
So he's securing the nation. He secures them to God first, now he's securing them physically. So this is kind of the way it reads when I read it.
It does for me as well. Chapter 7 began with this indication that there was some rest from their enemies, a lull in fighting. And I interpret this as David thinking that, well, the struggles of war are over for at least for a while, or maybe forever. And so let's build this house. If that is what David was thinking, it was short-sighted, because there's a lot of wars that come after that. And he doesn't really have that full rest for quite some time. It probably is not practical for him to be involved in this many wars and taking on a very ambitious building project. When we get to Solomon, we'll talk more about this, but Solomon, to accomplish this, had some very oppressive policies and taxation, and it drained the nation in a lot of ways to do this. And they were extremely wealthy at this time and prospering, but a lot of money, a lot of their possessions went in to the building of this temple and a lot of work as well. So that was not going to be possible at a time when there were also a lot of wars to be fought. Okay?
Well, I read that this chapter should be between chapters 5 and 6. And I also read that when he put to death 2/3 of these people, that ordinarily the conqueror would have killed everybody. So he spared 1/3 of them.
I am not 100% sure about it being between chapters 5 and 6. Some of those things probably did happen between there, because we see David fighting against the Philistines there at the end of chapter 5, beginning of chapter 6. So some of that probably did happen. Really, I think it doesn't slot in such a short period of time anyway. That these battles, these wars, went on for a long period of time. So it might have started back that early, but it certainly was not finished. There was a lot still to do, even after David had gotten Jerusalem there as this new capital. The timelines can be hard for us because these historical books don't go in pure chronological order all the time. They're talking about themes and ideas more than here's what happened on day 1 and then day 2 and then day 3. Things speed up and slow down and are shuffled around a little bit to discuss those themes. But yeah, there does seem to be some indication that at least the Philistine portion could be that early and some of these others later on. As for the other comment, yes, so we've been talking about this. Let's just go ahead and say what it is. In subjugating Moab, David defeated them. He conquered them in war, and then he made them lie down on the ground and measured them with a line. And it's a little bit odd the way this is worded, where you're saying, what is David doing? He's got 3 lines here, 2 lines he measured to be put to death, 1 full line to be spared. This is saying that David put 2/3 of them to death, 2/3 of the army, and left 1/3 of them alive. And that just seems heavy and a lot to deal with there of why did David do such a thing? Why is David killing so many people? Not in a battle. The battle is over. They have been conquered. They have been suppressed. But now after the battle, in putting them to death. This actually was pretty common practice at the time, and like Kay said, more than that as well, that typically they just killed all of them, or they would do something to otherwise hobble them and to make sure that they would not be a threat to them in the future. Do you remember what happened with the name of the city that escapes me at the moment, that was under threat in the early parts of Saul's reign? What that king had promised to do to them once he conquered them? Jeff? Yeah. Put one eye out of all of them. That's like a cruel and barbaric thing to do. But that was actually like some expression of mercy in those days, that he's saying, I'm not going to kill all of you, but I can't leave you there to build up strength and to be a threat to me in the future. So I'll put out an eye, from each of you, and then you're not going to be able to fight. You'll be able to stay there and to live, and this isn't entirely just out of the goodness of his heart. Also, you can pay tribute to me going forward. So we've got something similar here, though instead of maiming them, David just cuts down their numbers pretty heavily. And again, remember, this is a judgment from God as well. He has said that Moab is deserving of judgment and that they are going to be subjugated by Israel. They have not been devoted to destruction, with that word that we saw a lot in Joshua, that harem word, that everyone and everything must be destroyed. So David is not making the same mistake that Saul did in 1 Samuel 15, where he kept some of the animals, the best of the animals, to use as a sacrifice, kept the king alive. David is not making that same mistake because nowhere did God say, kill every last one of the Moabites. He said, subjugate them and defeat them and conquer them. And David was given some leeway to decide how to do that. And so this is the way that he does so. It is harsh, but it's not out of line with what was common at the time, and in fact was somewhat more merciful than what they probably expected. And there's some practicality to this as well, because we see that in keeping some of the Moabites alive, they're able to be useful to Israel. In verse 2, it says, the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. They're able to work the fields in the area and able to produce and then to give some of that production to Israel. This is an important step in the economic growth of the nation that needs to continue to excel and to grow. Steve?
I think I've got to still give, even though they're pagan or English words, I think he still offers them a chance to understand what is correct in his way, an example of his intention for the favored nation, Israel, was very faithful representatives of that. So I think it's similar to the way other instances of a nation attacking or doing something and not doing it correctly, not matching that way. Rather have obedience instead of sacrifice. So, I think Moabites were there for somewhat for that reason, they may come to learn consolation. So the instance with Joram and Hoshea and Elijah, the manner in which the Moabites were defeated was more kind of, this might be expectation. What were, they're just so headstrong, they smoke and imagine that they saw blood of their, seemingly their opponent's sister, and scattered all over the field. And figured they could just walk in and take whatever they wanted to. That's the worst military strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the important thing to see here is there's been a reversal of the typical outcomes between Moab and Israel. That Moab had been an oppressor and had been a danger to Israel for so long, and now that's been reversed in a way that Saul could not accomplish before, and that they even couldn't really accomplish under the judges, though they had some deliverances at different times. But only David has been able to subjugate and to free them from being concerned about the Moabites for a long time. Yes, the Moabites will be some trouble later on due to various failures of the people, but for a long time, things are going to be okay on that front because of David's great success. Next up in the list of wars, we have David going against Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. I wrote Rehab. That's obviously I got the wrong name there. But why did David go to war against this king of Zobah? Any context again? Gary.
Just, yes, to recover territories that have been lost.
Yes. So to recover. So in an interesting twist, it's not even so much the territory had been lost. It was more a territory that had never been taken in the first place that they were supposed to have. So if you go all the way back to Joshua, you'll remember all the battles that Israel fought there, and how they started off really strong and really faithful, and they had all these successes, and then we see them fizzling out as time goes on. And so there begin to be some more failures, that they're not conquering all of the peoples that they're supposed to. They leave some of those people alive. And so all throughout the nation, there's these little pockets of people who remain, and they're going to live among the Israelites and cause a lot of problems in the future. But aside from that, they also did not fully expand to the entire expanse of land that God had promised to them. We can look at the borders of the land that God said was theirs versus the borders of the land that they actually ended up with. And back when we studied Joshua, I had a map that showed that. And there were a few spots all around that were different, but does anyone remember where the main difference was geographically? It's okay, I'm bad with the geography too. But mostly in the north, right? They did not expand as far north as they could have, quite dramatically so. There was a large area to the north that was supposed to be theirs that they literally never went and fought for. They said, we're not going to do it. We aren't going to win. We'll stay with what we have here. And so even though God had promised it to them and God kept his promise to them to give them victory, God was not just going to hand them the lands that they wouldn't even go fight for. And so they've got this big missing area up north that they're supposed to have. Well, that's what David's fighting for here. The king of Zobah is in those territories. And so David is going to take land that they already have rights to. Okay.
In Genesis 15:18, it talks about, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates.
Yeah.
So this is what he's conquering.
Right.
River Euphrates.
Yes, because there in 2 Samuel 8:3, we've got that geographic marker showing that it's at the river Euphrates that David is fighting. So this is not arbitrary. This is not David just looking at a map and blindly saying, I'm going to go attack these people next. There's a reason for it. There's cause for him to go and fight for this land. It's land that has already been promised to Israel that they should have had already, but they've not gone to take. David's going to fix that. David's going to go take the fullness of the land that has been promised to them, or as close to it as he can get. And we see that he is quite successful as he does so. He is able to defeat Hadadezer, king of Zobah. And then we have an interesting thing that happens. It says in verse 4, and David took from him, and your translation might have this different than mine, don't worry too much about it. David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers, and David hamstrung all the chariot horses but left enough for 100 chariots. What's that about? Why would David hamstring most of the horses that he captured? Again, not from Rehab, from Hadadezer. Excuse me?
Deuteronomy 17.
Deuteronomy 17, yes. Steve?
I don't know about Deuteronomy
Okay.
I was just gonna give my
Yeah, what's your idea?
So my idea is that when you're in war, you know, you want to be able to manage the things that you can manage, not have extra resources that can be given away to the enemy.
Yeah, so there is a practical side to this, that it takes a lot to be able to manage this many horses, to keep up with them, to have men trained, to be able to use them in battle. Also, like, Israel is not really an area that you use horses in battle much because it's a bunch of hills and valleys and things like that. So there's not as much use for that in Israel as there is in some of these other places that are more plains. But the other side of this, aside from the practicality, is Deuteronomy 17, talking about that God told them, told every king of Israel, there in the law, do not amass for yourself many horses and chariots. Do not go to Egypt to get these chariots. That this is not for you. The horses and chariots are representations of military power. They are power that would allow them to go expand far beyond these borders. Again, not that useful right there in Israel, but very useful if you're going to try to create a world empire. God says, don't. That's not for you at all. Aaron?
I think it also is what kings and military leaders would put their trust in.
Yes.
And so I think it's also pretty significant that, the Israel people are to put their trust and faith and confidence in God.
Yeah.
Not in horses or chariots.
Yep. They're allowed to have armies, they're allowed to make preparations, but they're not allowed to trust in this amassing of power and to think that makes them invincible. Their trust is in God. God has shown time and time again that he can give them victory even with standard military doctrine not working out in their favor, with the numbers not being right or the technology being more advanced and on the side of their enemies. It doesn't matter when God is on your side. So do not amass these horses and chariots to just be a stumbling block for you later. And David takes that seriously here. He hamstrings most of them, only keeps 100. There's use for some of them, and 100 is not amassing. That's not keeping a large number when there were thousands here before. But David is remembering carefully what God told him to do. And if he can remember that from Deuteronomy 17:6, then that means maybe he did what God told the kings to do, of writing his copy of the law, of knowing it well, of trusting in what God had told him to do. 17:16. Okay, it's wrong on my notes, but that's fine. 17:16, thank you. Okay, and then we see not a war, but another event where this Toai or Tohu, depending on which one you're reading. He's the king of Hamath. He heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, and he sent a delegation to him with gifts. Why? Okay.
He had been fighting these people off and on for a long time.
Mhm.
So this took his enemy out of the way.
Yeah.
So he sent his son.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's some congratulations, some thankfulness here that you've defeated a common enemy. We're very happy to see that. Lita, do you have anything to add?
He was glad that he was able to defeat
Yeah. I think as well, there's probably another unsaid reason here, but just a practical reason, that David's pretty quickly growing in power and is having a lot of successes in war. And the people around are taking notice and either preparing to fight David or appease David. And the strategy of the king of Hamath is to appease David, to be on his good side, to thank him and to show his appreciation for defeating this common enemy. And then finally, the very end of the chapter shows us the way that David. Sorry, no. There's two things I want to talk about next time. I'm going to leave it to next time because I want to talk about what Mark was saying with those garrisons that were established in Edom and these other things, and then the way that David ruled there in the last few verses, and then we'll go on to chapter 9. I won't squeeze it all in. Thanks.